When it comes down to superhero rogue galleries, there's arguably none more iconic and recognizable throughout the course of history than Batman's collection of colorful and cunning enemies. With their visually striking character designs and fascinating dispositions, Batman's various adversaries have brought out the very best of the hero over the past decades, while simultaneously establishing their own reputations as compelling and exciting characters. Amongst the individual strengths of Batman's various rogues, there is also a broader audience appeal established by how minimally the specific personal traits of the different villains overlapped, ultimately enabling them to each showcase different aspects of Batman's personality and skill set. While Mr. Freeze isn't necessarily Batman's most universally recognized enemy, the depth of his character and tragically compelling backstory have cemented him as one of the more popular villains in not only the history of Batman, but the broader DC universe in general. But Mr. Freeze historically wasn't always the stoic and vengeful being we're so familiar with today, and in order to fully appreciate his modern characterization, it's beneficial to look back on how far he has come since his humble comic book debut in the late 1950s. To fully appreciate the success of Mr. Freeze's historical journey and properly speak to his overall impact and legacy, I'm going to first briefly review some of the earliest interpretations of the character in both comics and live action, followed by elaborating on the character's creative transformation and modern reimagining in the 1990s through Batman the Animated Series, while also highlighting some of my favorite interpretations of the character over the last 30 years. So go grab a cold beverage, kick back, relax, and chill while we dive into a complete breakdown of the history and evolution of Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze made his somewhat underwhelming comic debut as Mr. Zero in the 1959 issue of Batman number 121, where he used his ice gun to wreak havoc on the Cape Crusader and Boy Wonder while committing a series of robberies. In this original backstory, after inventing an ice gun charged with a cryogenic solution, he was inadvertently exposed to the chemical, causing him to become a human icicle, who is only capable of surviving in zero temperatures. But upon crafting himself an air-conditioned suit to accompany his ice gun and building himself a refrigerated mountain lair, he was now equipped with everything he needed to begin unleashing his spree of crime upon Gotham City. While the character was somewhat fun and silly, it was clear the writers didn't see much potential in him, as he was miraculously cured at the end of the issue and his short arc was seemingly ended with no additional comic appearances in the years to come. With the character seemingly at best on the back burner in the Batman comics, if not completely abandoned, the live-action Batman television series took the initiative of not only adapting him into their show, but also changing up his name and altering his appearance over the course of the series. In early 1966, the character made his official television debut as Dr. Art Shivel, aka Mr. Freeze, who is now given a slightly more sympathetic backstory than Mr. Zero, although nowhere near the level of the character's modern depiction. Much like his comic book counterpart, the live-action adaptation of Mr. Freeze was campy and over the top, which despite being on par for the time period and the target audience of the show, ultimately undermined the more sinister aspects of the character. Over the course of the series, the visual character design evolved to feature his cold bluish-gray skin, a more sophisticated cryosuit, and ridiculous, terrifyingly huge eyebrows. The first two having a persistent influence on the character design for years to come, and the third a certain attribute that I personally will not miss at all in its permanent omission. The result of the slightly invigorated popularity of the character through its live-action interpretations ultimately led to DC retconning Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze in 1968, albeit somewhat reluctantly. But regardless, the general tone of the character was set, and for the most part continued down this path over the next 20 years or so. Given the relatively flat characterization of Mr. Freeze, in contrast to Batman's other various enemies, he was largely unpopular amongst comic fans throughout the Silver and Bronze Ages, being perceived as a monotonal character of the week who would simply show up, cause trouble, and then disappear until his next appearance. While his character was relatively stagnant, there were a few changes to his appearance over those years, with the most drastic ones coming towards the end of the 80s in the form of his mechanized suit, which is now considered to be a key element of his modern design. But despite some visual upgrades, Mr. Freeze's overall uninteresting character never really allowed the comic writers to gain any real traction with him amongst a broader fan base. Interestingly enough, it wasn't until the character made his return to television in the early 90s that he would undergo his second and far more significant reimagining, this time coming in the form of animation. Enter Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, who were tasked with creating a Batman animated series, and in early development were working through the process of possibly revamping certain villains. In Mr. Freeze, they saw a character with great potential, but who also posed a significant challenge in his reinvention given his troubled and unpopular history. The pair sought out to re-establish the character's past reputation as a typical villain of the week, and were determined to create a highly impactful character with limited screen time to avoid overutilization to the point of reverting him back into a stock villain. And through the incredible combination of Dini's writing and Timm's direction, a tragic and compelling new character was born. A dark and complex individual with a devastatingly harrowing backstory, who was as emotionally cold as he was physically, and motivated primarily by hatred and his thirst for revenge. This reinvented character was a brilliant research scientist by the name of Dr. Victor Fries. He worked in cryogenics for a large corporation called Gothcorp, which paraded themselves through marketing as the People Company, while being run by a corrupt and sociopathic businessman behind the scenes. When Victor's beloved wife Nora is diagnosed with a rare terminal disease, he places her in a cryostasis to keep her alive while he attempts to find a cure. Unfortunately, when Gothcorp's CEO Ferris Boyle discovers the amount of funding going towards Freeze's unauthorized experiments, he demands that they be shut down even at the cost of Nora's life. In the ensuing confrontation, Boyle kicks Freeze into his lab station of cryogenic chemicals, seemingly killing him at the time, but actually transforming him into the cold, revenge-driven monster we now know as Mr. Freeze. With his newfound intimidating presence and emotionally charged motivations, Mr. Freeze found almost instant popularity when he returned to the television screen in the early 1990s. Heart of Ice was the third episode to air in Batman the Animated Series, premiering in September of 1992 to critical acclaim. It was flawlessly executed in terms of its writing and direction, striking a perfect balance between action and emotion to create a distinctly unique episode, which would go on to win a Daytime Emmy Award. While Paul Dini and Bruce Timm are certainly the masterminds behind the reinvention of Mr. Freeze, credit must also be given to Michael Ansara, the stoic and commanding voice behind the character, which is still so recognizable to this day. His iconic performance was critical in the overall reinvention of the character, as he brought the inherent talents needed to not only embody the character of Mr. Freeze, but elevate him to the levels that the writers were so ambitiously pursuing. In the powerful opening sequence of the initial episode, the new tone of the character was concisely established through a synergetic combination of Ansara's captivating performance, Dini's strong writing, and Timm's creative visual direction, making a lasting impression on audiences for years to come.
This is how I'll always remember you, surrounded by winter, forever young, forever beautiful. Rest well, my love. The monster who took you from me will soon learn that revenge is a dish best served cold.
To avoid oversaturating the character, Freeze would only make one more appearance in Batman the Animated Series in addition to Heart of Ice. His subsequent episode titled Deep Freeze went on to further explore the character's complex morality by centering around his unconditional love and devotion towards his wife. Unlike the 1960s, This time around, there was no reluctant hesitation to adapt Mr. Freeze's revised origin and other television characteristics into the comic books, with DC personally tapping Paul Dini to write a one-shot issue that would be released in 1997. In Batman, Mr. Freeze, Dini provides a significant elaboration on Freeze's tragic backstory by further exploring his traumatic and abusive childhood, as well as his life and relationship with his wife Nora. The issue provides further insight into Freeze's moral perspective, and makes the most of its one-shot format by employing bold plot elements in pursuit of developing an even darker and more elevated character. The comic allowed Dini to explore concepts far too dark and mature for the target audience of Batman the Animated Series. By taking the ambitious step of killing off Nora, Dini threw gasoline onto the fire of revenge already fueling Mr. Freeze, creating an even more dangerous monster which brought out the best in Batman, especially in the thrilling final confrontation of the issue. Dini's comic was released amongst a group of one-shots to coincide with the release of the 1997 Batman and Robin film, which saw Freeze make his return to live action and debut on the big screen. Despite Arnold Schwarzenegger delivering a memorable performance and the degree of effort in the costume design being very commendable, the film's campy and unserious tone undermined the adaptation of the character arguably as much as its abysmal overall quality. I can't help but enjoy the contrasting natures of Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's respective reactions to the Batman and Robin film when it was released. According to Dini, he was happy to see elements of Freeze's origin that were incorporated into the film, but he would have liked it if the whole picture had conveyed a level of emotion consistent to the few moments between Victor and Nora. Timm's response, on the other hand, was that he can't really provide a meaningful comment given that he's never actually been able to sit through more than 10 minutes or so of the movie. Despite the almost irredeemable quality of Batman and Robin, it was a relatively minor setback for Mr. Freeze, who bounced back in his return to animation through Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero, which released in early 1998. While the film was the first animated adaptation of the character without the creative minds of Dini and Timm, it picked up perfectly where they had left off in Deep Freeze and saw the return of Michael Ansara to the role he had so flawlessly brought to life before. Without missing a single beat, the film saw the character once again being utilized to his full potential. While first showcasing his cold demeanor and stoic determination amongst his other more sinister traits, it also provided him with a compelling redemption arc through an exciting and powerful story, and again brought out the very best in Batman and his allies throughout the process. His emotional character arc saw him arguably redeemed in the end, but regardless still forced to endure a life of cold and solitary isolation, able to gaze upon the world from a distance but never truly feel its warmth or inclusion, resulting in a bittersweet but incredibly touching conclusion. Sub-Zero was met with critical acclaim and instantly offset any negative impact to the character's reputation following the disappointment of Batman and Robin. Interestingly enough, its story was actually continued on by Dini and Timm in the new Batman Adventures episode titled Cold Comfort, which ironically ended up airing in late 1997 prior to the release of the film, which was pushed back to early 1998. In his return to animated television, Mr. Freeze was brought back in an even more sinister fashion, a corrupted soul who had become detached from his now remarried wife as the result of his own illness and the deterioration of his body stemming from his cryogenic condition. With seemingly nothing left, he lashes out at Gotham, seeking to purge the city of the hope and warmth that he himself was so innocently deprived of, while inflicting the very pain he feels onto Batman and the other citizens. By further dehumanizing the character beyond his own control, Dini and Timm were able to evolve him into a less noble and more evil and malicious villain, which they had originally intended to accomplish by killing off Nora, but were unable to do for continuity reasons. The climactic and mysterious ending to the episode gave Freeze a proper exit, but also left his future open to further utilization, which Dini and Timm would take full advantage of in their next overachieving animated series. When the character returned in the Batman Beyond episode titled Meltdown, Mr. Freeze was reduced to a disembodied head in cryogenic storage. While he had essentially gained immortality through his medical condition, he dreams only of death to the point of obsessing over it, seeking a permanent end to his infinite suffering. The episode explores the concept of whether or not a villain can ever be truly redeemed, and in Mr. Freeze's case, could the warm and kind-hearted Victor of his origin still exist after so many years of pain and suffering in cold isolation? The plotline sees him deceitfully convinced into undergoing a procedure that would give him the opportunity for a new life and a fresh start, by having his consciousness transferred into a new body created from his own DNA. But behind the scenes, he's being used as a guinea pig for greater purposes by Derek Powers, aka Blight, and the unethical corporation that he helms. Upon finally being able to experience the warmth of the world which he once sought to extinguish, Freeze is reinvigorated and determined to make up for his past in any way he can. Unfortunately, his new body begins to revert to the cryogenic nature of his former self due to his condition having inherently corrupted his DNA. He returns to the corporation for help, unknowing that they ultimately want to kill him and harvest his organs for research. Over the course of the episode, there's a persistent debate between Bruce and Terry about whether or not Freeze can really be trusted in his now reformed state. Bruce sees the worst in him, believing that he'll always revert to his vengeful nature which had sustained and motivated him for the bulk of his existence, while Terry, on the other hand, believes that his morality should not be underestimated, as he feels true guilt and sorrow for the pain he had once inflicted on the innocent people of Gotham. And in the end, after an exciting turn of events, they're both proven to be right to a certain extent. Upon being betrayed by a corrupt corporation, combined with his body reverting to a cryogenic state, Freeze's initial supervillain origin story is mirrored in this new futuristic plotline. But with everything that has since transpired with the character, his inherent motivations are different this time around. His years of cold loneliness, yearning only for death, combined with his short period of redemption where in stark contrast he was able to feel the warmth of a community, all continue to build on the moral density of the character. In the climactic finale of the episode, Freeze makes his final stand as he seeks to unleash his revenge on a corporation that wronged him while also putting an end to his own life in the process. In doing so, he ends up working with Batman against their common enemy, even saving Batman's life and getting him clear of the danger before he brings down the entire corporate building on himself to enact his final revenge. It is in this moment when we are treated to one of the single most heartbreaking lines of dialogue from a character whose entire existence is built on tragedy.
You gotta get out of here, Freeze. The whole place is gonna go.
Believe me, you're the only one who cares.
I sincerely apologize for the digression and the spoilers here, as I certainly did not plan to spend this much time discussing the Meltdown episode of Batman Beyond amongst Freeze's other iconic appearances, but this line just hits me so hard every single time I experience it. It perfectly expresses the depth of Freeze's tragic and lonely existence, and puts emphasis on a highly relatable and sympathetic aspect of the character, as the fear of loneliness and never being loved is something we all inherently dread as human beings. With Meltdown being Freeze's final appearance, at least in animated media from the creative minds of Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, the showrunners had strictly adhered to their personal policy of giving the character minimal screen time to avoid milking his newfound popularity and undermining his now highly compelling nature. In a total of 161 episodes released under their helm between the years of 1992 and 2001, Dini and Timm utilized the character in only 4 total episodes, but despite that, they still managed to elevate him to a level that nobody at the time was expecting. Amongst their incredible resumes and history of accolades, I personally think that the duo's reinvention of Mr. Freeze is easily one of their most impactful accomplishments, and if it isn't the first on the list, then it's gotta be a close second to the creation and introduction of Harley Quinn. From this point on, any remnants of Mr. Freeze from the Silver and Bronze ages of comics had become almost entirely irrelevant, as Victor Freeze had made his permanent impact on the world of superheroes, and much like his cryogenic condition gave his character prolonged life bordering immortality, he was now indefinitely here to stay. One of the most fascinating aspects of Freeze's new character design was how closely he mirrored the Caped Crusader who he consistently found himself at odds with. Both Batman and Freeze were born out of tragic circumstances, but where they contrast each other is in their actions, as the former seeks to enact justice, while the latter wants to inflict revenge. This is further explored through the differing perspectives of the characters, as in each of their respective minds they are fundamentally enforcing their own form of justice as a mean of channeling their rage and trauma. It plays perfectly into Freeze's moral complexity, especially given his different redemption arcs in which his actions are arguably heroic, putting increased emphasis on one of the greatest aspects of his character. Furthermore, Freeze is inherently built with highly sympathetic characteristics, in that reduced to his purest form, he is a man of extraordinary devotion. He will ultimately stop at nothing to save his wife, the woman he loves so dearly, and in losing her redirects his relentless ambition towards inflicting his revenge on the responsible individuals. Given that the people who he typically seeks revenge upon are often portrayed as more evil and irredeemable than himself, especially in his origin story, there's a case to be made that he's actually performing a greater good by eliminating the corrupt individuals who prey on the less fortunate. But despite this, his relentless devotion to his cause indirectly creates a tunnel vision for himself, and in losing his periphery, he ends up causing harm to innocent people who are anywhere from indirectly caught in the crossfire to deliberately massacred by his own hand. As a result of one of his greatest strengths becoming distorted into his greatest hubris, combined with his underlying reliance on sub-zero temperatures and inherently introverted personality, he's alienated from society almost entirely outside of his brief public outbursts. Solitary confinement is typically considered a cruel punishment with harsh psychological side effects that should be reserved for only the most dangerous individuals who are entirely deserving of it. And while Freeze's actions at times are certainly worthy of a harsh punishment, he was condemned to a life of indefinite solitude prior to ever even acting immorally. Even in his best moments of redemption, all he could ever provide was a heroic gesture before descending back into his inevitable suffering as a result of who he had become outside of his own control. At his best, Freeze is a redeemable and compelling character that you want to root for and see succeed despite the odds. At his worst, his tragic characteristics necessitate a level of sympathy towards him, even if it's as simple as mourning his transformation from a once compassionate and loving being into a sinister and homicidal monster. The result of all of this is that the sheer depth of the character's complex ethical nature draws you in at a level similar to or even arguably beyond other villains who boast far more elaborate ambitions and seek to inflict damage to society at a greater magnitude. This is what has formed the foundation of the character's legacy and will ultimately see him go down as not only one of Batman's, but DC Comics' all-time greatest supervillains. Throughout the years to follow Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's incredible reinvention of the character, there have been some interesting further adaptations of him in different types of media covering comic books, video games, and animated television. Before we finish up, I'd like to take this time to discuss some of my favorite iterations of the character from over the years subsequent to his reinvention. While I'd personally love to do a complete breakdown and analysis of the Heart of Ice episode of Batman the Animated Series, for example, which would probably be considered the greatest and single most transformative moment for the character of all time, I think I'll save that for another time and focus today on some of Freeze's less mainstream and more unconventional adaptations. While it would likely be considered one of the more relatively simplistic plotlines to incorporate Mr. Freeze, The 2005 release of Batman Gotham Knights issue 59, titled Fire and Ice, relied heavily on the individual character interactions between Batman and Mr. Freeze to tell its story, while effectively highlighting both the similar and contrasting aspects of the two characters' personalities. This issue subtly reminds me of the classic bottle episode format we commonly see used in television, with Batman and Mr. Freeze confined to a single small setting for the bulk of the issue, and the context of their situation being primarily established through flashbacks. While in television, bottle episodes are often intended to be cheap productions that put minimal demand on the writing and production crews, often at the expense of the quality of the episode, the format can also be used to create a dramatic emphasis on the spotlighted characters and allow for a deeper exploration of their inherent traits and motivations. In an attempt to keep this relatively spoiler-free, I would describe the situation that Batman and Freeze find themselves in as essentially a metaphorical poker game. Both Freeze and Batman are well aware that good poker players do not play their hands, they play their opponents, as they attempt to bluff and manipulate each other into being the first player to fold as the clock ticks down on their collective situation. The series of interactions between Freeze and Batman do an incredible job of illustrating the characters' inherently similar natures while also providing insight into their respective points of view. There's an intriguing dynamic established in how Batman and Freeze can essentially develop a better understanding into the mind of their counterpart through their own self-reflection, as the characters are so fundamentally relatable that they can increasingly empathize with each other through a deeper understanding of themselves. What makes this issue stand out to me amongst other Batman stories that utilize other villains is how both Batman and Mr. Freeze not only accept, but arguably embrace the common personality traits and motivations that they share. Given that almost all of Batman's adversaries mirror the Caped Crusader in one way or another, it's not unusual for them to monologue about how deep down they are fundamentally similar to him, with far more in common than what ultimately divides them. While the similarities are often reluctantly acknowledged by Batman, he will typically find a way to prove that this is at best an oversimplification, and through his actions will demonstrate to them that he is the superior being, whether that is morally, intellectually, or physically. This is not a bad thing, as it typically results in development to Batman's character while emphasizing his relentless heroism through a compelling climax. A villain typically serves as an obstacle for a hero to overcome, forcing them to innovate, evolve, and develop. But in Mr. Freeze's case, this concept applies simultaneously in both directions. As a result of Batman and Freeze's willingness to not only embrace their similar traits and motivations, but even go as far as to open up to each other and share some of their more personal details, it becomes their own shared story as opposed to just Batman's, with the two characters working to constantly pull each other up and elevate each other throughout the process. There may not necessarily be a clear-cut winner or loser, but the level of development to the characters over the course of the story through their interactions results in a very satisfying conclusion, as both of them are now better off from what they have collectively experienced. Another one of my favorite adaptations of Victor Freeze in recent years is from Sean Murphy's Batman White Knight, an incredibly successful series and the first title to launch under the DC Black label, which would feature dark new interpretations of the traditional DC universe and its characters from a variety of writers. Despite Freeze being a relatively minor character in the overall series, his backstory and intrinsic motivations were expanded onto a significant degree, and his character is woven into the greater storyline in a very creative and well-executed manner. While still embodying his traditionally cold and stoic demeanor, White Knight portrays Freeze as an increasingly complex emotional being, who harbors a deep burden of guilt inherited from the legacy of his deceased father, in addition to his relentless devotion to his sick wife. His effective utilization as a protagonistic figure who acts not as an adversary, but a true ally to both Bruce Wayne and Batman provides an exciting and refreshingly rewarding development arc for the character. For an individual who is almost always being confined to a life of suffering, even amongst his flashes of virtue which demonstrate the greater potential in his conflicted sense of morality, It is incredibly powerful to see him undergo a complete redemption arc in which he thrives as an agent of good and is rewarded for his actions by finally finding a degree of happiness. It is the ultimate vindication for such a historically tragic individual, and in the context of the story is unquestionably deserving given his acts of heroism. Over the course of his history, Freeze's moral ambiguity is typically something pretty strictly adhered to as a fundamental aspect of his character, so it was exciting to see the character successfully pushed to a clear side of the moral spectrum, and done so in such an incredibly well-executed fashion. But what if the reverse logic was applied, and Mr. Freeze was pushed to the opposite side of the moral spectrum that we saw in the White Knight series? This is the case in Batman One Bad Day, Mr. Freeze, a one-shot issue which focuses heavily on the concept of whether or not certain criminals can ever be truly redeemed. Its portrayal of Freeze saw a further humanized character, but also one far less deserving of sympathy or compassion. By highlighting the darker side of his relationship with Nora and showcasing his more selfish and controlling nature, Freeze was transformed into a darker being, now arguably deserving of his never-ending suffering, if not an even harsher punishment on top of it. This far less endearing and seemingly more irredeemable interpretation of Mr. Freeze serves to further complicate the question of whether or not a villain can ever entirely be reformed, and the writers use this as an effective foundation to tell an exciting, larger story that brings out some of the best qualities in both Batman and Robin. And with a somewhat ambiguous ending, albeit far from lacking in poetic substance and visual metaphors, it is almost entirely up to you as the reader in how to interpret the conclusion to Freeze's moral development arc over the course of the story. One of the major factors in choosing to highlight these 3 different comics today is that they all provide a unique insight into the character that, when viewed as a whole, can cover almost the entirety of his moral spectrum. In Gotham Knights issue 59, Freeze is of his more traditional and somewhat morally gray temperament, while White Knight and One Bad Day showcase the character at his very best and worst respectively. Finally, I want to give an honorable mention to the adaptation of Mr. Freeze seen in the Arkham video game series, specifically Arkham City, which always stands out to me as an incredible depiction of the character, but frankly one that I can't even attempt to analyze at this point until I get a chance to replay the game and refamiliarize myself with the details. But if you're looking to gain a better understanding into the nature of the character on top of his more traditional appearances, then I would certainly recommend those 3 readings. From his humble beginnings as a generally unpopular stock villain, and through his renowned transformation under the hands of Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, followed by his many subsequent impactful appearances, Mr. Freeze has permanently established his reputation as one of Batman's most iconic villains. The character's stoically intelligent demeanor, his cold and cunning nature, and most importantly his tragic and highly sympathetic existence have left a significant impression on fans over the last 30 years since his reinvention. His character can be viewed through a variety of lenses, and in doing so is capable of generating a broad audience appeal to a variety of fans of varying backgrounds and experiences. In the simpler aspects of the character, he is the pure embodiment of pain, loss, and suffering. On the more complicated side, he is a living paradox, a creature seemingly cold and dead to emotions, but also motivated purely by the most inherently primal human instincts like love, hatred, and the desire for revenge. Given Matt Reeves' incredible talent and ability to bring characters to life on the big screen in both highly compelling and relatable ways, I would certainly not be opposed to Mr. Freeze being adapted into the upcoming sequel to The Batman, or potentially in other future films under Reeves' helming. Pending the studio continues to honor Reeves' full authority over the creative direction of his Batman films, a character with the potential of Victor Freeze under his utilization is as much of a recipe for successful execution as ever, I would think. Regardless of the future, however, we will always be able to look back on the past and embrace the many remarkable interpretations of the character that we have been treated to over the years. And while we've really only scratched the surface of the tip of the iceberg that is the character of Mr. Freeze, I sincerely hope you enjoyed our collective journey through the broader history and evolution of the character today. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, or comment with your thoughts, but regardless, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.